Welcome to my project presentation for the Memory of Water, a parallel project that aims to capture my responses to very different places and my continuing relationship with and connection to water. These are the places I've lived throughout my life. I've always lived near water, primarily along the south coast and latterly inland, but near lakes and canals. Part 1. I want to contextualise the places I'm using as my source locations for this project. Location 1 is Totton and Ealing, in Hampshire on the south coast of England. They are situated right at the mouth of the Solent, which leads to the Isle of Wight. These are some words that I would associate with growing up in Totton. This came from a brainstorming session I had, reaching into my long-term memories to think about what associations I had at that time with the surrounding landscape. More words that come to mind when I think of the wider area, including the docks. It should say working waterways. Sometimes the word cloud generator splits my key phrases. My memories of early days growing up next to the river in Totton. It was literally a few metres from the back gate and surrounded by a wooded area where we played and built dens. We sometimes paddled or fished in the river, and it was a constant presence. Here you can see where the family home is situated, and the photo shows a flood in the 1960s. Whereas Totton is a utilitarian town and a suburb of Southampton, Ealing is an extension of the town and is a village that's far more picturesque and charming. It has a quay, pubs, a tide mill, a toll road, and a church where I was christened. The river next to my house flowed to here and then out into the Solent. Any romance about the area would be solely attributed to Ealing, not Totton. Totton is a functional town with a lot of housing and a rather unattractive precinct. Another key feature of my early life were the cranes. I could see them from my parents' bedroom window, and to me they always symbolised home. Even now when I drive back, they are one of the first indicators I'm back home again. I even wrote a poem about them when I was 19. These cranes service the boats that come into the Solent to offload their shipping containers. Southampton is a working port and is also used by cruise ships for docking as a start and end point for cruises around the world. Here are the cranes, viewed from Goatee Beach. Sad to say, Southampton is an ugly, soulless city that was bombed during the war. It has a precinct and lots of shops. It used to have a great art centre when I lived there, now sadly departed, and the best thing about it now is the art gallery. I never once missed it after I left, and I think that says a lot. There are some accurate comments on the picture. It does have the historical Bargate and city walls if you like that kind of thing, but I'm not really a history fan. It also has a waterfront that you can access in a couple of locations, but they're not exactly tourist worthy. Hence Southampton didn't feature in this project, as most of my time as a child was spent in Totton and Ealing. When I think about my life, water has always been a constant theme. I suppose I took for granted how close it was to me from birth, and never considered that one day I may not live on the coast, but that happened much later in my life. This is a poem I conceived right at the start of this project, when I was looking for my thoughts and feelings around the subject. It tries to demonstrate the circular nature of life and of water. Part 1 Project Work. Please note that the sketchbook work is all in a separate PowerPoint presentation, Project Sketchbook. This covers all parts of this project. After my initial sketchbook work, I used a photo transfer process using PVA glue and canvas panels. This was a process recommended by my tutor. I usually work with positive collage glued onto paper, and here I explored negative collage, taking away the image from the surface by using a transfer process. The process gives an interesting result, like holes in one's memory or degrading film over time. I had to work to build up some areas that had been lost in the process of the photo transfer. I used black watercolour pencil for a lot of the line work, and again for me this mirrors the process of an initial memory being vague and degraded, and then as we dwell upon it, we fill in the finer details and reach into the memory. These are fragments of the diptych, and they can be seen here with the Cranes poem that I wrote many years ago. I always wanted to create a piece of work to accompany this poem, and through this project the time was finally right. So this is a long-held ambition to create this work. The second piece on canvas board that I used to explore that area has a water poem that I alluded to earlier, and I again used the photo transfer process. Sadly, I lost most of the image as it didn't transfer very well, and I ended up scrubbing the canvas board. I then thought it fitted a vignette look, and this is a cropped area on the left-hand side of the board. Here's the finished piece, and you can see I've used dark colours to vignette the small area. This is actually the bank right next to the river, and there is the poem that I alluded to earlier on the right hand side. And here it is close up. I then went on to create a large A2 series of 3 pieces. So for this one, the first one, I repeated images of the local area, and there's a photo of a very young me and my older brother. The views are looking in from the sea and looking out to the sea, hence I titled it Looking In, Looking Out. The piece can be seen in progress on the left and finished on the right. The stencil work again aims to speak to the look of an old camera film or degraded memory. Here are the details. The second large A2 piece was focused upon local views and my relationship with my nan, who we lived with until I was 12. This shows the work in progress from the initial stage to the second stage where I started to stencil. Here's the completed work, and upon reflection I would say it's perhaps a little too dark in places and a little too opaque. I do like some of the following crop sections better. Here you can see the details. And again, here is some more detail where I repeated the image with my brother. The significance of the pylons is twofold. Firstly, I was very wary of that particular pylon as a child every time we walked past it. Secondly, the landscape at Goatee Beach in Ealing is dominated by the utilitarian aspects such as pylons and cranes. This is the third piece on A2 board, and here are the start and end pieces. I wanted to focus on my family's history with our home near the river. 4 generations of our family have now lived there, and my dad's grandma purchased the house in 1940. I wanted to imagine the generations of people who've grown up in that area. It's very easy to only see things solely from one's own perspective, but everywhere has a history and changes over time. Some of the maps were from the 1800s and showed a time before I existed in that area, before housing estates and buildings sprang up over the farms. Here are some details of the panel. Part 2. I moved to Bournemouth when I was 25 and I lived there for 10 years. Considering I'd grown up 30 odd miles away, it was like another world, and I'd rarely visited Bournemouth during my first 25 years. It's amazing when you think how much I love the beach, but I guess my parents didn't. Bournemouth is very touristy and temporary. As much as the location was lovely, I found it hard to feel part of any community there and only met a few significant people. I think it has the looks but no heart, if I'm honest, and is quite a superficial, transitory place. Like most seaside towns, scratch below the surface and you'll find all the usual social problems. But still, we only look at the facade. Picture postcard perfect. Welcome to Bournemouth. Here are words that come to mind when I think of this area and my time spent there. And here you can start to see emotions creeping into the experience. Part 2 project work. This was an initial investigation of a pastel piece based upon one of the photos that I'd taken of the area. I then made it into a mixed media canvas. Aside from the sketchbook work, this work was also part of my initial investigations, and I used an old canvas as a starting point, and based on my pastel sketch I worked it up. Here you can see the work in situ in my studio, and I've carried the mark making onto the sides of the box canvas. You can see in the background here the pastel sketch that it was based upon. I wasn't really overly satisfied with those initial explorations. I did a whole bunch more investigating in the sketchbook. This was the first piece I worked on plein air, attempting to loosen up, just to think about association, colour, memory, and to kind of create an impression of something located in that area of the world. This was another piece I made, again on a large box canvas. This is larger than the previous one. You can see the early layers on the in progress shot on the left, and on the right hand side you can see the completed piece. Here I'm focusing on a limited palette and looking at waveforms. And here you can see slices of colour from that large box canvas painting of the wave. I then worked on a couple more pieces, one of which can be seen on the left hand side in this image. And this was kind of fusing some of the colours from the initial piece that was on the easel in the previous picture, and then the second piece. So looking again at waveforms, exploring colour, gestural movement, and mixing of media. Here you can see the two completed pieces left and right, and in the middle you can see some of those slices of colour. And again, using abstraction and aleatory techniques. So this was acrylic and acrylic FW inks, and I like to spray the inks until they're quite dilute, and then use gravity as a means of just chance techniques to see how we can make particular shapes on the canvas that perhaps we're not fully in control of. Here you can see more slices of colour. And these are the two pieces side by side. I then moved on to work on another large canvas. This was one I again repurposed, but I don't have the images of the initial layers, sadly. This work here was done on, I think it was A4 canvas board. I'm looking at scratching out techniques, a bit of sgraffito, and starting to introduce other colours, so starting to expand the palette of the beach, thinking about things which are in the context of the beach, for example, people's bright summer clothes or swimming costumes, umbrellas, beach balls, beach paraphernalia, and the additional colours that creep in beside those kind of sand and sea colours. And this is the piece itself. This is quite large. Again, it's an A2. This is on a low profile canvas. And again, I've used quite gestural mark making, quite rough. It's not as smooth as some of those earlier waveforms. I also used some degrading paint to create those blue splatter marks in the foreground. I wanted to explore the properties of paint which had gone past its original use by, so that it almost becomes quite runny and quite unpredictable. And here are slices of that large piece on canvas. These were a couple of smaller pieces I worked on because I wanted to start to explore texture. So here I used heavy carvable modelling paste in the foreground for the waveforms. So these stand proud of the canvas. And then I used wet blending techniques in the background. So again, quite a limited seascape palette of blues and greens and whites. This is one of the panels of the diptych, and here is the other panel following the same process. And here are the two panels together. And then I thought it might be fun to kind of interrupt them by placing that large, more experimental piece in the middle. So rather than just having a diptych, which is quite obvious and more or less symmetrical, they are slightly different, I thought I'd interrupt in the central part by putting the large piece, and then also looking at the different shapes rather than just the waveforms to kind of break it up a little. Part 3. So I have to say I was dragged to this area very unwillingly back in 2006 due to work. For 2 years I wanted to move back to Bournemouth, and I actually had the opportunity to move back there in 2017, but by then I was settled here and I didn't want to go. I felt I'd been there and done that, and the chapter was closed. Even the coast and the presence of water could not lure me back. You can see on this map all 3 locations are shown, so you can see Southampton in the middle, Bournemouth on the left, and then I've placed the arrow to where I am now, which is between Farnham and Guildford and Surrey. So these are the words that come to mind when I think of this area, and it's a mix of good and bad. It's very much a commuter belt area. It is very overcrowded. But it does have some lovely countryside, some views. There are lots and lots of ponds, lakes, canals, but sadly we're a bit landlocked because we're not near the coast. Project work for part 3. So these were a set of preliminary exploratory works that I produced on A4 card. This one shows how fracturing the picture plane can change the image. There's a lot more about this series in the sketchbook for the project. This one uses symmetry and flipping of the image, and also very bright colours which are out of context with a naturalistic exploration of a view. Here I'm using fractals and photo collage to explore different views and slices of landscape. Here I combine 2 completely unrelated images to combine into a cohesive composition. Here I'm playing again with abstracting elements of water using photography and paint, and again using those dripping watery effects. And here I'm extending the image outwards towards the extent of the substrate. In this image I'm fading to black and playing with darker tones. This is a photo I took of Frensham Pond, and there's more context about this in the project sketchbook. I actually took a series of photos of the landscape that day in the middle of winter during the golden hour, i.e. sunset. So for this piece I started from an old red canvas that I had. I painted this years ago. It never really amounted to anything, it just sat in a pile of canvases, so I thought I'd repurpose. And I collaged some paper to form a land area. And this is the finished result, using the original marks on the canvas for the water area and then painting over them, using them as a guide. This is actually acrylic and soft pastel. I use soft pastel for the cloud areas, which I find works very well over the top of acrylic. I then moved on, and this was preparation for a larger piece based upon the series. This is taken from my sketchbook. And here you can see some of the close-up details of that larger piece. The process for starting the larger piece is shown here, which is one of my normal ways of working. Just taking some of my photos and then combining them, usually into a grid format. Sometimes I do vary it. And this is how it initially looked. And then we have sketchbook work, which instigated this, and then in progress shots of the larger work. I did write down some words on the feelings I had about moving here and then living here for the last 15 years. I put this onto very pale green tissue paper. And I then tore it up and collaged it onto that large substrate. On the left you can see the text is still showing, on the right the text is partially covered, which is the final piece. It did end up being quite opaque, but I think there was part of me that didn't really want those words to be completely on the surface. They're kind of emotions I have about something, which perhaps I don't want everyone to read or know about. So the covering up, I think, was possibly subconscious, but perhaps part of me felt it was necessary. And here's the body of work for part 3 minus the final large piece. This concludes the project presentation. Please also see my project video and project sketchbook presentations.